The universe is vast, cruel, and unfair, but it puts us exactly where we belong. This phrase, spoken by Loki in the series Loki, 2021, echoes a disconcerting truth. In the cosmos, nothing is out of place, but what if there is something deliberately hidden from us, something that refuses to be revealed? Since the beginning of time, humanity has contemplated the moon as a symbol of constancy and mystery, and yet half of this mystery has remained forever beyond our reach. The hidden side, a face of the moon that never turns towards Earth, keeping its secrets in the eternal silence of space. But when modern explorers dared to challenge the unseen, they discovered something profoundly different and profoundly strange. Why is there such a disparity between the two faces? Why does Earth's only natural satellite have such an inexplicable duality? And what, after all, could still be hidden in our sight? Today, we'll pierce the veil of silence on the far side of the moon, delving into science, mystery, and even theories that challenge everything we think we know. Because in this case, the question is not just what is hidden, the question is, why? The moon. She has been with us since before there was an us, since the first human eyes looked up to the sky. For millennia, she was our inseparable companion. On dark nights, a silent beacon that dominated myths and cultures around the world. But, like every enigmatic figure, it carries a secret. We have never seen half of the moon. That's right. No matter how hard humanity has tried, no matter how much telescopes have been pointed at it, one side of the moon has always remained out of reach, totally dedicated to the void of the cosmos. The hidden side is invisible to us, and has been so throughout human history, until very recently, and it is this characteristic that makes the moon so mysterious. Why? Why does she insist on hiding this side? However, this mystery is not a supernatural matter. It is the result of something scientists call gravitational coupling. The concept seems complicated, but it's simple. The same phenomenon that makes the moon orbit around the Earth also forces it to rotate on its own axis. Nothing much so far, but the moon takes exactly the same time to complete one revolution around the planet as it does to rotate around itself, which means that it is literally gravitationally locked, always showing the same face to us, a perfect cycle of 27.3 days. This may seem fascinating in itself, but it also raises uncomfortable questions. Why did this happen to our moon in particular? Is this synchrony common or extremely rare in the cosmos? The answer is a little of both. Yes, other celestial bodies in the solar system also exhibit gravitational coupling. A famous example is Jupiter's moon, Io, or Pluto's moon, Charon. But in the case of the Earth and its moon, the dance is so precisely balanced, so definitive, that it is practically impossible not to wonder, is this just a coincidence? Or is there something more? It was this peculiarity that sparked so much fascination and, of course, so much fuel for speculation over the decades. After all, if the moon only shows us one side, is there something on the hidden side that we shouldn't see? Modern science ended up leading us to this answer sooner or later. For millennia, our myths have filled the gap of the unknown. Ancient people believed that the hidden side was an abode of the gods or a prison for evil spirits. Plato, the Greek philosopher, even speculated that the moon hid cities invisible from the human eye, a preview of what would later be taken up by much more audacious theories, including conspiracies about alien structures hidden there. But for a long time, all of this belonged more to the realm of imagination than reality, until, in 1959, humanity finally crossed that limit. It was in that year that the Soviet probe Luna 3 captured the first images of the invisible. The world watched in amazement as the far side of the moon was revealed for the first time. But instead of bringing clarity, these images generated even more questions. The surprise was almost immediate. The hidden side was not remotely similar to the visible side. The differences were stark. The side we see every night here on Earth is relatively flat. Its dark patches, known as lunar seas, are vast. Low-lying areas, covered in solidified lava, formed billions of years ago. But the far side presented us with something completely different. A landscape almost entirely covered in craters. Small craters, huge craters, covering practically the entire surface. The seas, on the other hand, were practically non-existent. This raised the first big mystery about the moon. Why are the two faces so different? Shouldn't there be symmetry? After all, we are talking about a single celestial body. If meteor impacts shaped its surface, why didn't both sides suffer in the same way? The anomalies do not end there. Another perplexing discovery added even more fuel to the fire. The far side of the moon is significantly thicker than the visible side. Yes, that's right. The lunar crust in the hidden hemisphere is about 20 kilometers thicker than in the Earth-facing hemisphere. Here's what scientists know. Billions of years ago, when the moon was still forming, Earth's gravity began to influence its makeup. The visible side turned towards us. Under the influence of the heat radiated by the planet and its enormous gravitational force, this melted some of the crust on the visible side and created the lunar seas, while the opposite, more distant side remained intact and thick. A mystery partially solved, but still strange and insufficient to calm the minds of the curious. This intriguing asymmetry led to even bolder questions. Could the moon have an artificial origin? Was it a piece of rock formed from the Earth, as science suggests, or something more? Deliberate, conspiracy theories quickly emerged. Some have claimed that the far side of the moon could harbor hidden alien bases, and that global governments have always known this. Others imagine that the natural satellite functioned as a kind of artificial satellite with technology positioned there to spy on Earth, or even that it was placed there intentionally by a much more advanced extraterrestrial civilization. Scientifically speaking, none of these ideas have managed to stand the test of time. However, the question remains, is it really just a coincidence that the only lunar face visible to us is also the only one with seas and plains silently observing the planet? Will the dark side really keep its secrets forever? Today, with decades of space missions, we have much more knowledge about the far side of the moon than in that first image captured in 1959. But what we have learned only seems to leave us with even more doubts. This distant face continues to provoke us, and even though we can now observe it in high definition, it continues to represent the definitive mystery. How much of the cosmos is hidden from us for reasons we can't even understand? And, perhaps most importantly, what's yet to come? After the first Soviet victory with Luna 3, the space race between the Soviet Union and the United States continued to intensify interest in the moon. But as groundbreaking as the 1959 breakthrough was, the dark side was still far from being understood. The images made available by the Soviet probe were grainy, sometimes blurry, and did not allow for precise analysis. It was like peering through a fogged window. We knew something was there, but the details remained vague, which only fueled further theories and speculation throughout the 1960s. It was at the height of the space race, with the United States Apollo program, that the moon began to transform from an enigma to an object of direct study. While NASA's primary missions focused on manned landing on the lunar surface, the Apollo program also brought an unprecedented opportunity. For the first time, human astronauts would be able to look at the far side of the moon with their own eyes. In 1968, the Apollo 8 mission became the first manned spacecraft to orbit the moon. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders not only witnessed what no human being had seen before, but also documented in detail the dark vastness of the dark side. It was during this mission that the famous Earthrise was photographed, an iconic image of the Earth rising above the lunar horizon. But seen from the invisible side of the moon, the astronauts' descriptions of the far side were both scientific and poetic. They spoke of a cruel lunar horizon, disfigured by countless impacts, as if that side of the moon had been inhumanly punished over the eons. Unlike the visible side, which had plains and seas that seemed to calm the observer, the hidden side was extremely rugged, almost as if it represented an alien territory. A notable discovery was the anomalous magnetic field of several regions on the far side. Unlike the visible side, which had an almost non-existent lunar magnetic field, certain parts of the far side displayed strange, intense magnetic signatures that intrigued scientists. In the decades following Apollo 8, the moon continued to be explored not only by Americans, but also by the Soviets and, more recently, by new, emerging space powers such as China. Each mission brought a new piece to the puzzle, but the dark side remained an especially difficult region to study. This is because any ship or probe on the far side loses direct contact with Earth and becomes completely blind, unable to communicate, directly due to interference from the lunar body. One of the most audacious missions to study the moon was Apollo 11, led by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. Although the landing occurred on the visible side, the measurements and experiments carried out helped reinforce what scientists already suspected. The hidden side was not only different in topography, it had geological elements incompatible with the side we see. The Soviets, in turn, continued to lead unmanned missions to the far side in the 1970s and 1980s. The Luna series of probes and later the Lunokhod prototype confirmed that the crust on the far side of the moon was not only thicker, but also contained a significantly higher concentration of rare elements, such as thorium and uranium elements, associated with natural radioactivity. To some, this seemed to further reinforce the theory that the dark side had been bombarded by something different, or perhaps even deliberate. More recently, China's missions have helped put the issue back in the spotlight. In January 2019, the Chinese spacecraft Chang'e 4 made history by becoming the first probe to land on the far side of the moon. Chang'e 4 revealed high-resolution images and carried out experiments that confirmed the anomalies. The mineralogical composition is different, and the lack of large flat areas on the visible side remained an inexplicable phenomenon. Here's what we know. The visible side of the moon experiences fewer meteor impacts because the Earth acts as a sort of gravitational shield. In contrast, the hidden face is completely unprotected, remaining at the mercy of the hostile space. For billions of years, it has been bombarded by cosmic debris, which explains its cratered appearance. But again, that doesn't explain everything. If cosmic bombardment created the craters on the far side, why do the visible side have flat, dark seas? And even stranger, if the craters on the far side are a reflection of uncontrolled meteor impacts, how can we explain some perfectly circular depressions that even scientists cannot associate with natural impacts? There is something different happening in both hemispheres of the moon. Some experts suggest that the composition of the visible side was changed during the moon's formation. There are theories that, around 4.5 billion years ago, a gigantic body the size of Mars collided with the early Earth, stripping away a huge amount of material that eventually gave rise to the moon. This material merged into two distinct hemispheres, one heated and denser, the visible side, and another that, being less affected, remained colder and thicker, the hidden side. But others ask, why doesn't this dichotomy happen in other natural satellites? What is unique about the Earth and the moon? When we look at the far side of the moon, what we see today, or think we see, is much more than a mystery frozen in the silence of the void. From the first blurry images sent by the Luna 3 probe in 1959 to the sophisticated missions of the 21st century, much has changed. But one question has always remained in the background. Why is the hidden side so different from the side we see from here on Earth? To answer this, science, technology, and even international collaboration began to work with a single goal: to unlock the secrets of this lunar hemisphere that seemed to challenge both our curiosity and our own ability to explore. After the shocking revelation brought by the Soviet probe, Luna 3, the Moon, and, especially, its hidden side, became the biggest stage in the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. During the 1960s and 1970s, as the US Apollo missions began to take shape, it became apparent that exploring the Moon would be more than just political propaganda. It became a unique opportunity to unravel fundamental enigmas about our solar system. The Apollo missions, like Apollo 8, the first to circle the far side in 1968, brought astronauts an unprecedented view of terrain that seemed completely alien. Dizzying mountains, chaotic craters, and a brutal void that swallowed the horizon. If the visible side had been mapped over the centuries and cultivated a certain familiar air in our nights, the hidden side was unforgiving. Hostile and incredibly strange, said the astronauts, struck by the contrast. But the mysteries didn't stop there. Just as space agencies began launching probes to accurately map the Moon, a feature was noticed that could only be described as anomalous. The hidden side displayed an unusually thick crust, almost 20 kilometers larger compared to the visible side. If that wasn't strange enough. Preliminary analysis suggested that the far side had far fewer lunar seas, those dark patches formed by solidified lava. This went against all logic of geological uniformity. These first finds were the fuel for the next major foray into the dark side, with more countries becoming involved in lunar exploration and new sensors and mappers being released. A second era of great advances was about to begin. In the 1990s, with the end of the Cold War, lunar exploration changed its focus from a fierce competition between two superpowers to a global effort in search of scientific understanding. And it was in this context that missions like Clementine 1994 made a crucial technological leap. The Clementine spacecraft was one of the first to provide detailed topographic maps of the entire lunar terrain, including the far side, this time in very high resolution. Thanks to her, the portrait of an asymmetrical and deeply unusual moon began to take shape, while the visible side appeared relatively broken into lunar seas and smooth mountains. The far side was an intricate labyrinth of overlapping craters and impact regions that had brutally shaped its surface. More than that, the radar data revealed a shocking feature: a gigantic impact crater on the far side called the South Pole Aitken Basin, widely considered to be one of the oldest and largest impact craters known in the solar system, about 2,500 kilometers in diameter. This feature revealed not only the geological depth of the Moon, but also brought intriguing clues about its formation. Here's the interesting detail. It is believed that the impact that created the basin reached layers of rock so deep that it exposed the lunar mantle, something that could never have been observed on the visible side. And that opened the door to something even more interesting. What is the true interior of the Moon? And why is it more exposed on the hidden side? In the 21st century, a new power entered the race to explore the Moon in depth: China, with its Chang'e program, named after the moon goddess from Chinese mythology. The country has made spectacular advances in lunar exploration, culminating in 2019. In the historic landing of the Chang'e 4 probe on the far side of the Moon, it was the first time that any equipment had successfully landed in this hemisphere, and the challenges to this were not few. One of the biggest difficulties was the complete lack of direct communication with Earth. The far side has no line of sight with our planet, meaning any attempt at direct contact would be impossible. The solution? Create a specific satellite, called Qiqiao, which acts as a bridge between the probe and command centers on Earth. Chang'e 4 brought with it a robotic rover called U-2, which roamed the surface, inspecting the mineral composition of the hidden side. Some of the most impressive finds were evidence of materials, potentially originating from the lunar mantle, a soil composition rich in rare minerals, such as olivine and pyroxene, which indicate geological processes that have been active for billions of years. Analyses that reinforce the theory that the far side was exposed to much more intense cosmic bombardment than any other region of the moon. This scientific milestone put China at the forefront of lunar exploration and reignited interest in using the dark side for something even more ambitious. One of the greatest potentials of the far side of the moon is not in its geology or what it hides beneath the surface, but in what is not there. Because it is in a position naturally protected from radio transmissions from Earth, the far side is practically a cosmic silence, a refuge for astronomers who want to listen to the subtlest whispers of the universe. Imagine this: a huge network of radio telescopes installed on the far side, capable of picking up radio signals from the deep universe. These telescopes could search for the first signs of stars formed shortly after the Big Bang, track distant exoplanets, and even detect signs of intelligent life in other star systems. An extraordinary idea, which depends precisely on the unique stillness of the hidden side. Agencies such as NASA, ESA, European Space Agency, and CNSA, China Space Agency, are already beginning to discuss proposals to transform this lunar region into the largest astronomical observatory of all time. Another crucial topic is the possibility of creating permanent bases on the far side of the moon. These bases would serve not only for scientific exploration, but as a kind of springboard for interplanetary missions. Think about it. Launching rockets to Mars or beyond from the surface of the moon would be much more efficient than trying to launch directly from Earth, due to weaker gravity. And we are no longer talking about pure science fiction. The European Space Agency, ESA, and other global players are already developing technologies for lunar mining, which could focus on resources such as helium-3, frozen water, and rare metals found on the far side. These materials could be used directly as fuel or in the construction of new infrastructure, essentially transforming the moon into a true off-planet base of operations. And the mysteries continue. As much as we have learned over the last 70 years, the hidden side still holds more questions than answers. Why, for example, is there almost no lunar sea there? What is the true composition of the lunar mantle that appears so close to the surface on the far side? And what other secrets will this unnoticed region let us stumble upon in the future? No matter how much science advances, there is something that never seems to disappear when we talk about the far side of the moon: the controversies and speculations that surround its existence. They arise both from their unusual geological features and from the way governments, scientists, and even science fiction have constructed narratives around them. On the one hand, experts claim that we know more today about the occult side than at any other time in human history. On the other hand, there are those who believe that the true mystery of the moon lies not in what has been discovered, but in what continues to be hidden. And if there's one thing that fuels these controversies, it's the fact that, even with so much technological advancement, many of the moon's biggest secrets remain unexplained. Since the first images captured by Luna 3 in 1959, a disturbing pattern began to emerge in the intricacies of conspiracy theories. What if something or someone chose to intentionally hide the dark side? Too many, it seemed absurd. But the absence of concrete answers only fueled speculation that the hidden side was not just different from the visible side. He could be keeping things we didn't want or shouldn't know. The arrival of the Chang'e 4 probe in 2019 was the culmination of decades of debate about what was really there. Even before the landing, rumors arose that the hidden side could house secret bases, artificial structures, or even extraterrestrial installations. These theories were quickly dismissed by scientists involved with the mission. But one question remains: why did the governments of the largest space powers avoid exploring the far side of the moon in such a direct way for so long? This lack of direct exploration, at least until the arrival of Chang'e 4, was fuel for arguments that something was being actively hidden among all the conspiracy theories ever created about the far side of the moon. Few are as bizarre as the idea that the Nazis managed to establish a secret base on the far side during or after World War II. This theory gained traction especially in the 1950s, with the rise of pulp stories and speculative fiction about Nazi technological advances. According to this idea, Hitler's scientists would have developed advanced anti-gravity ships, such as the supposed Haunebu flying saucers, and escaped to the moon after Germany's defeat. There, on the hidden side, they would have built a self-sufficient base to continue their experiments. Although obviously fanciful, this theory entered pop culture, being mentioned in books and films like Iron Sky. But, like all good rumors, it contains an element of distorted truth. In fact, German scientists were developing advanced technology at the end of the war. And some of these scientists were absorbed into the US and USSR space programs during the so-called Operation Paperclip. This was enough for the conspirators to connect non-existent dots and create a fantastic narrative. Speaking of controversial theories, let's address one of the discoveries that most caught fire among conspirators: the supposed artificial structures detected on the far side of the moon. In particular, the so-called lunar tower, which entered the internet's radar after low resolution. Images from space probes showed a strange shadow in a certain region of the far side. Some observers claimed that this shadow looked like a gigantic, vertical object, a tower that projected hundreds of meters above the surface. For the more creative, this was definitive proof that alien civilizations had used or still use the dark side as a base. NASA denied any basis for these claims, citing resolution limitations and misinterpretation of the images. But for conspiracy theorists, this was just another cover-up attempt. In fact, accusations that NASA is hiding crucial information have become frequent, reinforcing the idea that what matters about the far side of the moon is not what has been revealed, but what continues to be omitted among all the speculations. The potential for the hidden side to harbor traces of extraterrestrial life is, without a doubt, the most enduring and fascinating topic. Here, we are not just talking about theories involving UFOs and flying saucers, but something more grounded: the possibility that the hidden side may store signs or traces of extraterrestrial organisms that, at some point, would have had contact with the moon. Several scientists argue that, due to its unique position and the way it preserves untouched craters, the hidden side could be a true archive of the cosmos. It could store particles, minerals, and even molecules from other celestial bodies that were brought to the moon by meteor or comet impacts. Some have even speculated that if life began elsewhere in the solar system like Mars or Europa, the moon would be one of the best places to find its remains. However, these ideas also generated controversy. Anti-expansionist groups have often stated that searches for life on the far side of the moon are, in fact, excuses to camouflage projects with military purposes, including the installation of space weapons in a strategically inaccessible location on Earth. Another point of great controversy revolves around control over the far side of the moon. International treaties prohibit national claims to celestial bodies, but this does not mean that countries are not competing for the exploration of the satellite. And, in the case of the hidden side, the dispute is even more intense. For example, the ice found in craters on the far side is seen as a global strategic resource. Ice means water, and water can be turned into oxygen, rocket fuel, and of course, life support in future space colonies. China, with its Chang'e program, has claimed a leading role in exploring the dark side, which has generated tensions with other nations that fear a monopoly on lunar resources. The possibility of bases installed on the hidden side, whether for research or mining, has already led to heated debates about the potential use of this region as a military territory. a lunar base in the moon's most remote hemisphere would be invisible to observers on Earth, making it a strategic point for confidential operations. Despite the controversies, science remains the fundamental pillar for separating what is possible from what are mere fantasies. With advanced missions like Chang'e 4 and future proposals for multilateral lunar stations, many dark side enigmas are slowly beginning to be resolved. And here's something curious. Even when a scientific discovery disproves a conspiracy theory, it doesn't stop new speculations from emerging. If there's anything untouchable about the dark side, at least in our collective imagination, it's its power to instill doubts, fears, and fantasies. There is something peculiar about the far side of the moon. It is not just any piece of the cosmos, a dust among so many worlds that we barely know. He is as much a part of us as the Earth itself. What, at first, seemed to be just a geological anomaly, a hidden half, ended up becoming one of the greatest symbols of mystery, fascination, and discoveries for humanity over the centuries. But what does the far side of the moon teach us? What does it actually represent? Perhaps the true power of the dark side lies not just in the silence of its craters or the thickness of its crust, but in the way it forces us to face a profound truth. We still know so little about the universe, and even about that which is so close to us. Exploring the far side of the moon was more than an effort at technological advancement. It was a symbol of our ability to go further. When the Luna 3 probe first sent back its grainy images of that pristine landscape, something changed. Our idea of proximity and distance gave way to a new perception. The unknown is not just in the stars, but also in our own shadows. Later missions, such as the Apollo, the Clementine probes, and the Chang'e 4, consolidated our scientific understanding of one of the greatest lunar enigmas. The far side is a time capsule, a geological archive that contains clues not only about the moon, but about the origin of the Earth and the solar system itself. And yet, with each answer found, new questions arise that require more boldness and more imagination. The Earth and the moon share a bond that is impossible to ignore. The dark side shows us this like no other part of the cosmos could. It reveals not only the fragility of our world, but also its interconnectedness with everything that surrounds it. Its formation, billions of years ago, belongs to the same catastrophic event that gave rise to modern Earth. It is, in essence, a piece of us, and, even though it is hidden from our eyes, it has shaped us as much as what we can see. But beyond science, the far side of the moon also redefines how we imagine the unknown. It has become a cultural icon, a place where we project both our fears and our deepest hopes. The classic example of this are the countless stories about aliens or secret bases hidden there. The very idea of a dark side of the moon gives us the uncomfortable feeling that on the peripheries of everything we know, there are forces actively watching us. This side we never see also plays a special role in our symbolic relationship with the cosmos. It is a subtle reminder that something will always be beyond our reach, something hidden in the dark. For many, the hidden side represents the very idea of mystery that exists. But it challenges us to face our limitations. Books, films, music, and works of art have relentlessly explored this duality more than 50 years after its release. Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon remains one of the most iconic and performed works of modern music, encapsulating human feelings of isolation, doubt, but also fascination with what remains out of sight. And perhaps therein lies one of its greatest legacies. The far side of the moon reminds us that the unknown should not be feared, but explored. He is a living metaphor for how humanity advances, not because it knows everything, but precisely because it doesn't. As mythical as the far side of the moon has become, scientific advances in recent years show that it is also incredibly practical. Resources such as water, ice, rare metals, and even its natural position for cosmic observations make it one of the most valuable lands in the solar system. So the hidden side is not just interesting, it could be essential to the future of space exploration. However, with so much international interest and competition, the question remains, who will have the power to decide what happens to it? Will we continue to seek scientific answers and explore their potential in a cooperative way? Or, like so many other times in human history, will it become yet another field of disputes for political influence and economic control? The future of Darkseid is uncertain, but that's exactly what makes it so captivating. He shows that even in a world where technology seems to give us access to everything, there will always be territories we still need to discover and, perhaps, understand ourselves better in the process. Ultimately, the far side of the moon is more than a physical location. He is a deeply human symbol. He is the reminder that no matter how far we advance, there will always be something that resists, something that remains silent, something that challenges us to look closer, to question more, and to understand better. Every time we look at the moon, perhaps without even realizing it, we are confronting our own hidden side. What defines us as individuals and as a species is not always what we show to the world, but also what we choose to keep hidden, what we leave unexplored. The deep craters we carry, the empty seas that we ignore within us, the legacy of the far side of the moon is not just in its craters, but in how it shapes the way we understand the world. He reminds us, in a paradoxical way, that sometimes what is out of sight, what seems small, distant, and irrelevant, can hold the biggest answers to our questions. Or, at least, the biggest questions we still need to ask.